The heavy, metallic, rhythmic pounding coming from inside the massive high-pressure steel water intake pipe at the Blackwood Municipal Water Plant at 3:42 a.m. wasn't just terrifying because I was the only utility operator on the midnight to 8 shift, but because that specific pipe vault had been completely drained, decommissioned, and welded shut with 3-inch industrial steel plates since the winter of 1982. My name is Wyatt, and my job at this remote facility, nestled deep in the damp, claustrophobic pine forests of northern Pennsylvania, was usually incredibly boring, consisting of logging chemical levels and staring at flickering green telemetry screens that hummed in the heavy silence. The facility itself was a relic of Cold War-era industrial architecture, a sprawling maze of damp concrete corridors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and deep subterranean pipe galleries that sat directly over a vast, ancient underground river system. Tonight, the air inside the control room felt different. It was thick, freezing cold, and smelled heavily of stagnant river mud and decaying water vegetation, a stench that seemed to be actively leaking from the ventilation shafts despite the facility's heavy-duty air filtration systems. I tried to convince myself that the echoing thuds were just a water hammer or air trapped in the active lines. But as I stood up from my vinyl chair, the digital flow rate monitor for the dry vault force suddenly spiked, showing an impossible displacement of 300 gallons per minute, as if something incredibly massive was moving through a pipe that was supposed to contain nothing but dry rust and dead spiders. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I turned my attention to the closed-circuit security monitors, my eyes scanning the low-resolution, black and white feed of the subterranean pipe gallery 30 feet below my office, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw the heavy steel hatch of the decommissioned dry pipe actively bulging outward with every slow, wet, deliberate blow from the inside. The heavy iron bolts securing the hatch were vibrating under the immense pressure, and as I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror, one of the massive rusted nuts slowly began to unscrew itself, turning against the thread with a screeching metallic groan that echoed up through the concrete floorboards beneath my feet. I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight and my radio, my fingers trembling so violently I almost dropped them, and forced myself down the cold, dripping concrete steps leading into the humid darkness of the underground gallery, the smell of ancient rot growing so intense that it made my eyes water. The deeper I went, the louder the sound became, but it was no longer just a metallic clang. It had transitioned into a wet, scraping slither, accompanied by a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. The wet, choking, airless whisper of a human voice calling out my name from behind the steel plates, sounding exactly like Marcus, the night operator who had mysteriously vanished from this very shift 3 weeks ago without leaving a single trace. "Wyatt, please open the valve. It's so dark and cold down here into the river. They don't let us sleep." The voice wheezed, punctuated by a horrific, wet coughing sound that sounded like wet sand being dragged through a throat. I stopped dead on the bottom step, the beam of my flashlight shaking across the glistening, wet walls of the gallery, revealing that the moisture dripping down the concrete wasn't condensation, but thick, black river silt that was slowly oozing from the sealed seams of Vault 4. I wanted to turn and run, to climb those stairs and never look back, but my legs felt like poured lead, rooted to the cold floor as I watched a second bolt pop off the steel hatch with a sound like a gunshot, flying across the room and shattering a glass pressure gauge on the opposite wall. The water pressure inside the sealed vault was rising on the gauges, defying all physical laws, climbing past 200 pounds per square inch as the steel structure groaned and warped before my very eyes. Suddenly, the main breaker panel on the wall violently erupted in a shower of brilliant blue sparks, plunging the entire underground facility into absolute, suffocating pitch blackness, save for the weak, fading yellow beam of my flashlight, which began to flicker rapidly as if the battery was being actively drained by something supernatural in the room. In the darkness, the remaining steel bolts began to snap in rapid succession. Crack, 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 followed by the deafening, metallic shriek of the welded steel plates tearing open like wet cardboard under an immense, unnatural force. A massive wave of freezing, stagnant, mud-laden water rushed over my boots, knocking me off my feet and washing my flashlight out of my hand, leaving me scrambling in the wet dark as the heavy, dragging sound of something thick and waterlogged began to pull itself out of the broken pipe and slide across the concrete floor toward me. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough concrete, screaming into my dead radio for help that I knew was miles away, when the beam of my dropped flashlight suddenly rolled across the wet floor, briefly illuminating a tall, bloated, semi-translucent figure standing directly over me. Its skin was the color of curdled milk, peeling away in wet, translucent strips to reveal dark, writhing river leeches and squirming water insects underneath, and its eyes were completely gone, replaced by empty, dark sockets filled with swirling, black river water that spilled down its hollow cheeks like tears. But the most terrifying part was its face. Despite the bloating and the rot, I could clearly recognize the distorted, agonized features of Marcus, his jaw stretched open at an impossible, broken angle, his mouth filled with black mud and jagged river stones as he reached down toward me with long, dripping fingers that ended in sharp, exposed bone. I tried to scream, but the freezing, muddy water rising around my chest suddenly felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, pinning me to the floor as Marcus's wet, icy hands wrapped around my throat with a grip like an industrial vice. He didn't pull me up. Instead, he began to drag me backward, my back scraping agonizingly against the concrete floor, pulling me closer and closer to the yawning, black, dripping mouth of the broken dry pipe. I thrashed and kicked, my fingers desperately clawing at the wet concrete, trying to find anything to hold on to, but my hands only found slick mud and rusted bolts as the freezing darkness of the pipe swallowed my legs, then my waist, and finally my chest. The last thing I ever saw before the dark, stagnant water filled my nose and mouth, was my flashlight finally dying on the floor, leaving me in absolute, eternal darkness, listening to the wet, rhythmic whisper of 100 drowned voices welcoming me to the silent, black depths beneath the river. Watching the live security feed at 2:14 a.m. on my graveyard shift at the Shady Pines self-storage facility in rural Oregon was usually a lesson in sensory deprivation. But tonight, the absolute silence of the office was shattered when the heavy, padlocked steel door of Unit 308, a unit that had been officially welded shut by the County Sheriff's Department following a gruesome cult ritual in 1994, slowly, smoothly slid upward into the ceiling, revealing a yawning rectangle of absolute light, consuming blackness. My name is Cassie, and I was working this job to pay off my college tuition, spending my nights in a small, bulletproof glass booth surrounded by 32 security monitors showing empty, gravel-paved corridors lined with identical orange metal doors. The facility was completely surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence and miles of dense, whispering pine forest, meaning there was absolutely no one here but me. Yet as I stared at the monitor for hallway C, the motion sensor light suddenly tripped, bathing the corridor in a harsh, yellow glare that only seemed to make the darkness inside Unit 308 look deeper and more unnatural. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the glass, and watched in mounting dread as the pitch-black darkness within the open unit began to slowly undulate and spill out onto the concrete floor like a thick, sentient liquid, defying the laws of physics as it crept against the artificial light. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a glitch in the old analog camera system, but then the camera's infrared night vision mode automatically clicked on, and what I saw made my stomach drop into a cold abyss of primal panic. A tall, impossibly thin shadow, lacking any physical form but possessing a jagged, humanoid silhouette, was slowly dragging itself out of Unit 308, its limbs bending at unnatural, broken angles as it clung to the corrugated metal walls, leaving a wet, black, scorching residue wherever it touched. It didn't walk. It glided with a sickening, jerking motion, its head tilting from side to side as if it was actively searching for something, and then with a speed that made me gasp, it snapped its head directly toward the camera lens, its face displaying two glowing, hollow white pinpricks of light where eyes should have been. I scrambled back from the desk, my chair violently clattering against the wall, as the security monitor displaying hallway C suddenly erupted in a violent static, followed by the monitor for hallway D, and then hallway E, as if the entity was physically moving through the facility, destroying the cameras one by one as it drew closer to the main office. Panic seized me, and I grabbed the heavy ring of master keys, intending to sprint to my car and drive away. But when I reached for the heavy steel deadbolt of the office door, the digital keypad lock on the wall suddenly hissed, the green light turning solid, mocking red as the internal relays clicked, locking me inside the booth from the outside. I beat my fists against the reinforced glass, screaming for help into the empty night, but the thick pine forest only swallowed my voice, leaving me with the terrifying realization that I was trapped in a small, enclosed space with something that shouldn't exist. The power in the main office flickered violently and then died completely, leaving me in the suffocating darkness of the booth, with only the pale, ghostly glow of my smartphone screen illuminating my terrified face. Outside, in a long, echoing concrete corridor just beyond the office's drywall, I heard the slow, heavy scraping sound of something metallic being dragged along the floor, accompanied by a low, rhythmic clicking sound like long, overgrown fingernails tapping against the steel walls. Tap, tap, tap. I pressed myself into the corner of the booth, clutching a pair of industrial scissors, my eyes wide and straining in the darkness, when the office intercom system, which was only connected to the call boxes in the storage hallways, suddenly buzzed to life with a screech of high-pitched feedback. Through the static, a voice began to speak, but it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was my own voice, sounding exactly like me, repeating the words I had logged in the shift report just an hour prior, but spoken in a flat, monotone, lifeless cadence. Cassie is alone. Cassie is in the office. Cassie is waiting for us in Unit 308. The tapping sound on the other side of the wall stopped, replaced by a soft, wet pressure pressing against the reinforced glass of my security booth, and as I watched, a thick, black, oily substance began to seep through the seams of the glass window, dripping onto my desk and sizzling as it ate through the paperwork. I looked up, and in the faint light of my phone, I saw the jagged, shadow-like silhouette standing on the other side of the glass, its face pressed flat against the pane, the two glowing white pinpricks of its eyes burning directly into my soul. I tried to crawl under the metal desk, but the air in the room had turned so cold that my hands froze to the metal, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath came out in thick, white plumes that hung in the stagnant air. The glass began to spiderweb with deep, frosty cracks, the sound of the structural failure echoing like gunshots in the tiny space. As the phone in my hand began to glitch, the screen displaying a distorted, static-filled image of the inside of Unit 308, where dozens of dark, shadow-like figures were standing in a circle, waiting. I closed my eyes and began to pray, the darkness in the room growing so heavy and suffocating that I felt like I was drowning in dry ash, as the sound of the reinforced glass finally shattering into 1,000 pieces echoed through the office. I felt the cold, wet touch of shadow-thin fingers wrapping around my ankles with a grip that bruised my skin, pulling me slowly, inevitably out from under the desk and across the shattered glass, dragging me out of the broken office and down the pitch-black corridor of hallway C, toward the open, whispering void of Unit 308, where the steel door slowly began to slide back down, sealing me in the dark forever. Finding a freshly written, dripping wet logbook entry on my desk at the Isolated Point Lookout Lighthouse Museum in Maine at 3:15 a.m., written in my own handwriting and detailing my own brutal death, was the exact moment I realized the violent winter storm raging outside wasn't the most dangerous thing trapped on this rocky cliff tonight. My name is Garrett, and as the winter night watchman of this historic, decommissioned lighthouse-turned-museum, my duties were simple: walk the spiral stairs, check the generator, and ensure the historic artifacts remained undisturbed. But tonight, a nor'easter had completely cut off the peninsula, leaving the rocky island isolated under a howling, freezing gale and a black, churning Atlantic Ocean that slammed against the stone foundation with a force that made the entire tower vibrate. The logbook on my desk was an old, leather-bound volume used for historical display. Yet when I had returned from my patrol of the lower gallery, the book was lying wide open, the yellowed paper soaked with freezing seawater and dark sea kelp, with the fresh ink still running down the page in thick, black streaks that read, 4 a.m. Garrett climbs the lantern room to fix the rotating lens. He does not see the thing climbing the iron ladder behind him. The glass breaks. He falls into the rocks below. My breath hitched, my mind frantically trying to rationalize the prank. But there was absolutely no one else on the island, and the heavy oak entrance door of the lighthouse was padlocked from the inside with a thick brass chain that was still completely untouched. As I stood staring at the wet ink, a sudden, violent surge of electricity shook the lighthouse, and the backup generator in the basement coughed, sputtered, and died, plunging the entire stone structure into a freezing, echoing darkness, save for the emergency battery-operated wall lights that cast long, distorted shadows up the spiral staircase. From high above in the lantern room, a sound began to echo down the stone cylinder. The slow, rhythmic, wet clanging of metal against metal, as if someone wearing heavy, old-fashioned brass diving boots was slowly descending the iron spiral stairs. Klang vet schlitter. I grabbed my heavy industrial flashlight, its bright beam cutting through the damp air, and began to slowly climb the stairs, my boots squeaking on the cold iron, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out the howling wind outside. The air grew rapidly colder with every step I took, smelling intensely of deep ocean brine, rotting whale carcass, and wet canvas. And as I reached the landing of the third floor, I saw that the stone walls were glistening with fresh, freezing seawater that was actively running down the spiral structure like a miniature waterfall. I called out, my voice echoing hollowly up the shaft, but the only response was a sudden, wet, whistling sigh that seemed to come from the shadows just above my head, followed by the distinct sound of someone wetly dragging their feet across the iron grating of the observation platform. I shone my flashlight upward, and the beam illuminated the dripping wet, bloated canvas sleeve of an old-fashioned 19th century deep-sea diving suit, the fabric rotted and covered in dark barnacles. But as the beam moved up to the heavy brass helmet, I realized with a jolt of pure horror that the thick glass faceplate of the helmet was completely shattered, and inside the dark cavity of the helmet, there was no human face, only a writhing, pulsing mass of pale, deep-sea worm-like tentacles that reached out into the cold air, sensing my warmth. The creature let out a wet, rattling screech that vibrated through the stone walls and began to descend the stairs toward me with an impossible, jerking speed, its heavy brass boots smashing against the iron steps with a deafening, metallic roar. When the office intercom system, which was only connected to the call boxes in the storage hallways, suddenly buzzed to life with a screech of high-pitched feedback. Through the static, a voice began to speak, but it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was my own voice, sounding exactly like me, repeating the words I had logged in the shift report just an hour prior, but spoken in a flat, monotone, lifeless cadence. Cassie is alone. Cassie is in the office. Cassie is waiting for us in Unit 308. The tapping sound on the other side of the wall stopped, replaced by a soft, wet pressure pressing against the reinforced glass of my security booth, and as I watched, a thick, black, oily substance began to seep through the seams of the glass window, dripping onto my desk and sizzling as it ate through the paperwork. I looked up, and in the faint light of my phone, I saw the jagged, shadow-like silhouette standing on the other side of the glass, its face pressed flat against the pane, the two glowing white pinpricks of its eyes burning directly into my soul. I tried to crawl under the metal desk, but the air in the room had turned so cold that my hands froze to the metal, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath came out in thick, white plumes that hung in the stagnant air. The glass began to spiderweb with deep, frosty cracks, the sound of the structural failure echoing like gunshots in the tiny space. As the phone in my hand began to glitch, the screen displaying a distorted, static-filled image of the inside of Unit 308, where dozens of dark, shadow-like figures were standing in a circle, waiting. I closed my eyes and began to pray, the darkness in the room growing so heavy and suffocating that I felt like I was drowning in dry ash, as the sound of the reinforced glass finally shattering into 1,000 pieces echoed through the office. The heavily dented, rust-covered 1970s black sedan rolling slowly toward my isolated highway toll booth at 2:14 a.m. wasn't the reason my adrenaline spiked, but the fact that the driver's window rolled down automatically to reveal a completely empty front seat, followed by a soaking wet, bone-white human hand extending out of the void to hand me a freezing, slime-coated $5 bill. My name is Xander, and I work the graveyard shift on Route 9, a barren, cracked stretch of asphalt cutting straight through the desolate flats of eastern New Mexico, surrounded by nothing but cacti, blowing dust, and an oppressive pitch-black night sky. Usually, I saw maybe 3 cars a night, mostly long-haul truckers trying to stay awake, so the dead silence of the desert was my only companion. The toll plaza itself was ancient, built in the late 60s, with flickering sodium lights that cast a sickening yellow glow over the cracked asphalt, making every shadow look stretched and distorted. But the moment that ancient sedan stopped in front of my glass booth, the absolute silence was replaced by a low, guttural humming sound that vibrated through the concrete floor beneath my boots, and the temperature inside my small air-conditioned booth plummeted so fast that my breath instantly turned into thick, white plumes. I froze, my hand hovering just inches away from the freezing $5 bill held by that impossible, unmoving white hand, noticing that the fingernails were completely torn off, leaving raw, blackened skin that smelled intensely of stagnant swamp water, sulfur, and electrical fire. I looked past the hand into the dark interior of the car, straining my eyes in the dim yellow glow of the toll plaza lights. But the space inside was a localized vortex of pure shadow, completely swallowing the light, though I could clearly hear the wet, heavy, ragged breathing of something incredibly massive sitting in the dark, suffocating space. The dashboard lights of the sedan were dead, but a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, like heavy fingernails tapping against the steering wheel, echoed from the darkness, accompanied by the distinct sound of dripping water, which made no sense given that we were in the middle of a historic desert drought. "Keep the change, Xander," a voice suddenly rasped from inside the empty car, sounding like 2 heavy stones grinding together under immense water pressure, sending a bolt of pure, primal terror straight down my spine because I had never told this driver my name, and my employee badge was hidden beneath my heavy winter jacket. Before I could scream or react, the pale hand snapped backward into the darkness. The car's engine roared to life with a deafening, metallic shriek, and the vehicle violently accelerated forward, smashing through the heavy wooden toll barrier, breaking it in half with a loud crack that echoed across the empty desert flats. I stood paralyzed in my booth, clutching the freezing, damp $5 bill, watching the taillights of the black sedan vanish into the midnight fog within seconds, leaving me entirely alone under the flickering neon sign of the plaza. I frantically reached for the landline phone to call the highway patrol, but the moment my fingers touched the plastic receiver, the line erupted into a deafening, high-pitched screech of static, followed by the wet, bubbling sound of someone drowning, punctuated by the horrific cadence of my own voice laughing hysterically from the other end of the line. Panic completely seized me, and I turned around to bolt toward my truck parked behind the booth. But when I looked through the rear glass pane, I realized with a sickening jolt that the desert sand outside was swirling unnaturally, forming a massive, silent wall of dust that completely encircled the toll plaza, trapping me inside a cage of wind and dark. Suddenly, the automated toll bell above the lane began to ring aggressively. Ding, 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 signaling that another vehicle had entered the plaza. But when I looked at the lanes, they were completely empty, save for a long trail of thick, black, steaming footprints that were appearing out of nowhere on the asphalt, walking slowly and deliberately toward the door of my booth. The heavy steel door of my booth, padlocked from the inside, began to shudder violently, as if a massive physical weight was throwing itself against the metal from the outside, the iron hinges groaning under an immense supernatural pressure that warped the frame. I scrambled backward into the furthest corner of the booth, kicking my desk over to use as a shield, clutching a rusted metal tire iron in my shaking hands as the reinforced glass windows of the booth began to shatter inward one by one, showering the small room in sharp fragments. The thick black desert wind poured through the broken windows, bringing with it the overpowering stench of rotting wood and old copper. And as I watched in absolute, hopeless horror, the shadows in the corner of the room began to detach themselves from the wall, twisting and coalescing into a tall, featureless humanoid silhouette that towered over me. The entity possessed no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. Yet I could feel its absolute, burning hatred focused entirely on me as it reached out with long, shadow-thin arms that stretched across the room, its fingers morphing into sharp, jagged spikes of dark energy. The air inside the booth became so thin and frozen that my lungs burned with every gasp, and the floorboards began to crack as the shadow's weightless form pressed down upon the structure. I swung the tire iron with all my remaining strength, but the metal passed clean through the shadow like smoke, sending me crashing hard onto the glass-strewn floor as the entity's freezing hands wrapped around my ankles, its touch burning my skin like liquid nitrogen. I screamed as I was dragged backward out of the broken window into the roaring, pitch-black dust storm outside, my fingers desperately clawing at the rough asphalt until my nails broke and bled, leaving me entirely at the mercy of the void that swallowed me whole, ensuring that my name would just become another unsolved missing persons case on the lonely, haunted stretches of Route 9. The rusted, ancient analog dial on the master control console at the Illinois Central train switching yard violently slammed into the red zone at 3:11 a.m., broadcasting an impossible, deafening alarm because the digital tracking monitor showed a phantom freight train traveling at 90 miles per hour on track 7, a track that had been completely dismantled and buried under 6 feet of concrete gravel since a catastrophic boiler explosion killed 12 workers in the winter of 1950. My name is Delaney, and as the Midnight Yardmaster, my job was to sit in a 3-story elevated concrete control tower overlooking hundreds of acres of dark, winding steel tracks, operating the manual switches to guide cargo trains through the rural heart of the state. It was a lonely, exhausting job, usually defined by the distant screech of iron wheels and the steady hum of industrial generators. But tonight, a freezing, unnatural fog had rolled in from the surrounding cornfields, blanketed the tracks so thickly that I couldn't even see the ground directly below my balcony windows. When the phantom blip appeared on the screen, moving with an impossible, erratic speed that defied the physical limitations of the yard, I immediately grabbed my radio to alert the incoming morning crew, but the speaker only emitted a low, rhythmic, metallic clicking sound, followed by the faint, agonizing sound of teeth chattering violently in freezing cold water. I leaned against the massive glass window, wiping away the condensation with my sleeve, and looked down into the swirling white fog toward track 7, my heart hammering against my ribs as a sound began to echo from the distance. The deep, resonant, terrifying chugging of an old steam locomotive, accompanied by the sharp, metallic wail of a train whistle that sounded less like machinery and more like a collective human scream of pure agony. Through the thick veil of fog, a massive, towering shape emerged, a colossal locomotive forged from blackened, scorched iron that seemed to actively bleed thick, oily soot into the air, its massive steel wheels grinding against the long-dead, invisible rails with a sound that shook the concrete foundations of my tower. The train didn't possess any headlights, but the windows of the passenger cars behind the engine were illuminated by a pale, sickly green glow, revealing the silhouettes of dozens of passengers sitting perfectly still, their heads tilted back at unnatural, broken angles, staring straight up into the ceilings of the cars with wide, unblinking eyes. I wanted to look away, to run down the metal stairs and flee into the dark cornfields, but my eyes were locked onto the observation deck of the final car as the train ground to a sudden, violent halt directly beneath my tower, the brakes screeching with a frequency that instantly shattered the glass panels of the lower floor below me. The door of the final passenger car slowly creaked open on rusted hinges, and the fog began to rise rapidly up the sides of the concrete tower like a living entity, crawling through the broken window frames and bringing with it the overpowering stench of coal smoke, burnt flesh, and damp earth. Suddenly, the electric lights in my control room died completely, leaving the yard in absolute darkness, save for the pale green light emitting from the phantom train below, which cast long, jagged shadows across the control panel. From the darkness of the stairwell directly behind my chair, I heard the heavy, wet, rhythmic thud of someone climbing the metal steps, their boots covered in heavy mud, accompanied by the sound of a metal shovel dragging along the iron grating. Scrape, clang, scrape, clang. I backed away from the door, my hands frantically searching the dark desk until they wrapped around a heavy iron coupling pin, my breath catching in my throat as the door to the control room slowly creaked open, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway. It was dressed in the charred, shredded denim overalls of a 1950s train fireman, its skin entirely burned away to reveal blackened bone and charred muscle tissue. But the most horrific part was its face. Its skull was split completely down the middle from the old explosion, and inside the glowing, fiery rift of its face, two molten eyes burned with supernatural fury. The creature's chest cavity was completely exposed, showing a glowing furnace of embers burning inside its ribcage, crackling loudly in the freezing silence of the room. "Shifts over, Delaney. Time to shovel the coal," the entity whispered, its voice echoing inside my own head like a physical blow, its scorched hand reaching out to grab my collar with a grip that instantly melted through my heavy canvas jacket, searing my flesh. I screamed in agony, swinging the iron coupling pin with all my might into the center of its split skull. But the heavy weapon merely passed through the creature's ethereal form with a hollow hiss, leaving me entirely defenseless as the fireman violently dragged me out onto the concrete balcony. Looking down through the swirling green fog, I saw that the doors to all the passenger cars were now wide open, and the dozens of shadowy, broken passengers were standing on the tracks, their empty sockets looking up at me, their jaws dropped open in a silent, terrifying chorus of welcome as the fireman lifted me over the railing and dropped me into the waiting, freezing dark below, where the tracks realigned themselves to trap me in their eternal, grinding loop. The heavy, reinforced glass door of industrial dryer number 9 at the 24-hour spin-clean laundromat in a derelict district of Detroit suddenly began to shake violently at 3 a.m., its internal drums spinning backward at a furious speed despite the fact that the main power breaker for that entire wall had been shut off for maintenance since a young woman was found brutally suffocated inside it 3 months ago. My name is Vance, and as the solitary night attendant, my job consisted of cleaning spilled detergent, emptying lint traps, and ensuring the local drunks didn't sleep on the folding tables. The laundromat was an old, depressing building with flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like angry hornets, surrounded by abandoned brick warehouses and empty lots that remained completely dark throughout the night. I was sitting behind the laminate counter, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, when the rhythmic, deafening thump-thump-thump of Dryer 9 shattered the silence. The sound so intense that it caused the plastic bottles of bleach on the shelves to vibrate and crash onto the tile floor. I stood up, holding a heavy wooden mop handle, my nerves frayed as I walked down the narrow aisle between the rows of white machines, noticing that the air in the back of the laundromat had suddenly grown intensely humid and thick, smelling of boiling water, cheap floral soap, and the distinct metallic tang of fresh blood. As I drew closer to Dryer 9, I realized with absolute horror that the glass window wasn't showing clothes. The inside of the drum was completely filled with a swirling, dark red liquid that splashed violently against the glass, and pressing flat against the center of the window from the inside was a pair of small, pale human hands, their fingers desperately clawing at the rubber seal. My breath caught in my throat as a face suddenly slammed against the glass from within the dark red vortex. A face with wide, terrified eyes and an open mouth that was silently screaming for help, its features matching exactly the newspaper photographs of Brenda, the girl who had died inside the machine during the summer. I stumbled backward, dropping the mop handle as the digital timer on the dead machine suddenly lit up, flashing the number 666 before the internal heater erupted with a bright, blinding orange glow that began to literally boil the liquid inside. The plastic frame of the machine began to warp and melt from the extreme, unnatural heat, and a low, agonizing wail began to echo out of the lint trap below, the sound growing louder and more distorted until it resembled a mechanical shriek of pure torment. I turned to sprint toward the front glass exit doors, but the moment I reached the middle aisle, the automated rolling metal shutters of the building violently slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing the windows and doors behind thick, interlocking slats of steel, cutting off all outside light and sound. The fluorescent lights above my head began to explode one by one in rapid succession, showering the aisle in glass sparks, until the only light remaining was the hellish, glowing orange eye of Dryer 9 at the back of the room. In the darkness, the heavy metal latch of the dryer door suddenly popped open with a loud, metallic snap, and the dark red liquid poured out onto the tile floor, steaming and sizzling as it flowed down the aisle toward my boots like a river of boiling wax. But the liquid wasn't empty. Out of the open drum, a wet, clicking mass of discarded, blood-soaked clothing and long, tangled human hair began to pull itself out onto the floor, shifting and assembling itself into a grotesque, crawling shape that possessed multiple elongated limbs made of twisted fabric and exposed bone. The entity crawled down the aisle with a terrifying spider-like speed, its structural pieces clicking against the tiles, emitting a wet, choking sound that sounded like Brenda trying to clear water from her lungs. I scrambled onto one of the metal folding tables, drawing my legs up to my chest as the boiling red pool surrounded the base of the table, melting the rubber feet of the structure and causing it to tilt dangerously. The fabric entity reached the edge of the table, its face composed of a shifting mass of dark hair and pale, rotted skin, its empty black eyes locking onto mine as it stretched open a jaw made of jagged, rusted metal zippers that ground together with a sickening crunch. "You forgot to clean the lint trap, Vance," the thing wheezed, its voice a horrific mixture of Brenda's screams and the mechanical roar of an industrial engine, before its long, fabric-bound arms shot forward, wrapping around my waist with a burning, crushing force that instantly broke my ribs. I thrashed and struck at the creature, but the boiling heat emanating from its body instantly blistered my hands, leaving me entirely helpless as I was violently pulled off the table into the steaming, red liquid on the floor, dragged backward down the aisle toward the open, glowing mouth of Dryer 9, which violently slammed shut the moment my body was forced inside its dark, spinning metal tomb. The dead, unregistered emergency broadcast frequency suddenly overrode the automated late-night feed at the isolated WPNY radio transmitter station in the snowy woods of northern Vermont at 1:45 a.m., playing a live, crystal-clear audio feed of me, sitting inside my own soundproof studio, breathing softly into the microphone, followed immediately by a heavy, wet, rhythmic thumping sound against the triple-paned glass window directly behind my head. My name is Sterling, and as the sole graveyard shift audio engineer and broadcast technician, my job was to monitor the telemetry data, manage the automated playlists, and ensure our 50,000-watt signal didn't drop offline during the brutal winter storms that frequently battered the mountain ridge. The station itself was a lonely, modern brick concrete bunker surrounded by a dense, whispering forest of dead pines, completely isolated from civilization by a 5-mile private access road that was currently blocked by 3 feet of fresh snow. I froze in my swivel chair, my fingers paralyzing over the mixing console as my own voice, distorted by a strange metallic pitch, began to emanate from the studio monitor speakers, narrating my exact physical movements with a cold, breathless, monotone delivery that made my skin crawl with primal dread. The voice on the speaker wasn't delayed. It was completely in real time, describing how my hand was shaking and how the sweat was dripping down my neck, creating a terrifying psychological loop that made me feel like an animal trapped in a glass cage. I forced myself to slowly turn my head toward the heavy glass window that separated the master control room from the dark, unlit live performance studio, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. In the dim, sickly green glow of the audio rack lights, I could see that the glass wasn't empty. A thick, black, oily frost was rapidly spreading across the pane from the inside of the dark room, and pressed flat against the glass was the distorted, elongated silhouette of a human figure that seemed to be actively constructed out of pure, undulating television, static, and shadow. The entity didn't possess any discernible facial features, yet two piercing, hollow white pinpricks of light burned through the static where its eyes should have been, locking onto me with a gaze that radiated an ancient, supernatural malice that instantly made the air inside my booth drop below freezing. I scrambled backward, my chair violently slamming against the metal equipment racks behind me, throwing my hands out to grab a heavy brass cleaning tool as the landline telephone on my desk suddenly began to ring with a deafening, metallic shriek that sounded completely wrong, its internal bell vibrating so hard that the plastic casing began to crack. The sound of the phone was amplified through the studio microphones, creating a feedback loop that pierced my ears and made them bleed, but the automated speakerphone system clicked on by itself before I could touch it. Through the howling static of the call, the wet, choking, airless screams of the station manager who had left the building 6 hours ago erupted into the room, his voice sounding like it was being dragged from the bottom of a deep, watery abyss. "Turn off the transmitter, Sterling. It's not a signal. It's a door. They're using the high-frequency waves to tear through the physical fabric of the room." He wheezed before his voice violently transitioned into a wet, popping sound, followed by a high-pitched, deafening squeal of electrical feedback that instantly shattered every single fluorescent tube in the ceiling, plunging the entire control bunker into absolute, terrifying darkness. The only light remaining was the pale, ghostly green glare of the digital audio level meters on the board, which were violently peaking into the red zone, dancing rhythmically to the sound of heavy, wet, barefoot footsteps that were now echoing inside the control room with me, even though the heavy steel security door was still completely locked and latched. I swung my flashlight around with a screaming gasp, the beam cutting through the thick, humid air which now smelled intensely of burning ozone, wet copper, and rotted pond vegetation, and the light illuminated the entity standing less than 5 feet away from my desk. Its body was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and bending backward at sickening, jagged angles as it moved with a jerky, stop-motion cadence, leaving a trail of black, scorching residue on the linoleum floor with every step it took toward me. I screamed in absolute terror, throwing the brass tool directly at its chest, but the metal simply passed clean through its static flesh torso, emitting a loud hiss of blue sparks as the tool struck the back wall, leaving me entirely defenseless in the corner of the room. The entity raised a long, shadow-thin arm, its fingers morphing into jagged, needle-like frequencies of pure dark energy that vibrated with a sound that caused my vision to blur, and as its freezing, weightless hand wrapped around my throat, the physical world around me began to dissolve into a vortex of white noise. I tried to thrash and kick, my fingers desperately clawing at the rough concrete wall until my nails ripped, but the crushing, supernatural force of the entity pulled me off my feet, dragging my body toward the main high-voltage transmitter cabinet where the glass doors had shattered open, revealing a swirling, black void of pure electrical energy that was humming with the screams of 1,000 lost souls. The last thing I ever felt before my consciousness was entirely ripped from my physical body and scattered across the dead airwaves was the cold, wet touch of the static entity pulling me into the spinning, glowing vortex, ensuring that my final, terrified scream would be broadcast across the entire state of Vermont for eternity, a phantom frequency that would never go silent. The rusted, heavy iron door of Cold Storage Vault 3 inside the subterranean pathology morgue of the old Savannah Medical Center violently slammed open at 1:12 a.m., discharging a thick, freezing cloud of black formaldehyde steam into the room, despite the fact that the entire wing had been padlocked, sealed, and designated a biohazard dead zone since a strange, flesh-rotting, supernatural parasite claimed the lives of the entire night pathology staff in the winter of 1976. My name is Mallory, and as the newly hired night inventory clerk, my duties were supposed to be strictly administrative, consisting of cataloging old medical archives and checking the temperature seals on the active modern cooling units located 2 floors above this forgotten, crumbling basement. The sub-basement was a horrifying relic of mid-century medical architecture, a damp, claustrophobic maze of peeling green tile walls, exposed leaking pipes, and flickering amber lights that hummed with a low, depressing frequency that made the silence feel heavy and suffocating. When the distant metallic crash of Vault 3 echoed down the corridor, I immediately dropped my digital clipboard, my heart instantly leaping into my throat as the air around me turned so intensely cold that the sweat on my palms turned to ice and my breath escaped in thick, frantic clouds. I held my heavy industrial flashlight before me, its beam trembling across the damp floorboards where a thick, black, oily sludge was actively oozing out from the open mouth of Vault 3, defying gravity as it slowly crawled against the slope of the concrete floor directly toward my boots. The sludge smelled of ancient death and chemical decay, filling the narrow corridor with a stench so foul that it made my stomach violently churn and my eyes water in the dim light. I tried to convince myself that it was just a burst chemical pipe or an old drainage failure from the floors above. But then the emergency backup siren on the wall began to wail with a distorted, low-pitched groan, and the old rotary wall phone behind my desk began to ring, its sound hollow and frantic in the dark space. I picked up the receiver with a shaking hand, hoping desperately to hear the security guard's voice from the lobby. But the earpiece only emitted the wet, bubbling, rhythmic scraping sound of someone drowning in thick fluid, followed by a wet, clicking whisper that sounded like dozens of insects crawling inside the line, repeating my name over and over again. Mallory, the inventory is incomplete. We need a new vessel for the rot. Open your veins to the soil. The collective voice hissed before the line went completely dead, leaving a sickening trail of black liquid dripping out of the earpiece onto my hand. I dropped the receiver in horror, stumbling backward into the aisle between the metal storage shelves as the amber lights above my head violently exploded one by one in rapid succession, showering the corridor in hot glass and leaving me in absolute pitch-black darkness save for the fading, yellow beam of my flashlight. Through the darkness, from the direction of Vault 3, a sound began to emerge that made my blood run entirely cold. The heavy, wet, scraping sound of a massive, unformed weight dragging itself along the tiles, accompanied by the distinct, frantic clicking of rusted surgical tools bouncing against concrete. I shone my flashlight down the long aisle, and the beam illuminated a nightmare that defied all human sanity. A tall, grotesque, multi-limbed entity was crawling toward me with a sickening, spider-like speed, its body constructed from an amalgamation of decayed human skin, yellowed skeletal remains, and rusted medical wire, all held together by a writhing, pulsing mass of black, parasitic tendrils that oozed the foul-smelling sludge. The entity didn't have a single face, but rather a collection of distorted, half-rotted human jaws sewn into its torso, all of them opening and closing in a silent, terrifying rhythm as its hollow, black eye sockets locked onto my light. I turned and ran in a blind panic, my boots slipping in the black sludge that was now rapidly rising around my ankles, filling the entire corridor with the overpowering stench of rotting flesh and stagnant swamp water. I reached the heavy steel fire exit door at the end of the hallway and threw my entire weight against the panic bar, but the door wouldn't budge. The iron frame had been completely encased in a thick, crystalline layer of black ice that had frozen the hinges solid, sealing me inside the sub-basement like a tomb. Behind me, the clicking and wet dragging sound stopped, replaced by a soft, icy draft that hit the back of my neck, carrying with it the terrifying cadence of a collective human voice whispering directly into my ears. "You're already part of the record, Mallory." I turned around, my back pressed flat against the frozen steel door, and watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the entity's long, needle-sharp tendrils shot forward out of the dark, wrapping around my wrists and ankles with a supernatural strength that shattered my bones, dragging me slowly, inevitably back down the corridor toward the yawning, frozen black mouth of Vault 3, where the iron door slowly slammed shut behind me, erasing my existence from the world above forever.